Okay, guys, hey, how you doing? The United States, 1865 to 1910. Got a cold, got a frog in my throat, but I'm gonna macho up here and try to get this taken care of for you. So, yeah, a period of transition. The period between the end of the Civil War and the dawn of the 20th century is enormously complex, but what I would like to do is examine it by way of a quick survey of six salient themes that, taken together, provide a fairly thorough composite portrait of the United States in the late 19th century. And I would like to begin by talking about the Reconstruction of the South between 1865 and 1877. When the Civil War came to an end in 1865, there was a mammoth task that confronted the United States government, which was how to reintegrate into the Union a region equaling roughly 1/3 of the territory of the entire country, populated largely by people split down the middle, one half farmer slaves, deeply thrilled to be free, the other half white people who were for the most part ambivalent at best and infuriated at worst over this fact and resentful over having lost the war and seeing the former slaves as omnipresent evidence of the dramatic turn in their fortunes. How do you keep the peace between these folks? This was not going to be any easy task, and even before his assassination, President Abraham Lincoln had defined this challenge as the Reconstruction of the South. But Reconstruction had several different meanings. To begin with, the South needed physical reconstruction. The war had blown much of the region to smithereens, with towns and cities partly or entirely burned and blown up, bridges, railways, and port facilities destroyed, farmlands burnt. These areas had to be rehabilitated and rebuilt, and quickly, to get the South back up on her feet, men employed, and the economy back up and running. This would go a long way to easing the emotional pain of losing the war, and was the first and most direct part of the process. Political reconstruction meant the passage of laws at the federal and state and local level to protect the local rights of the freedmen. Some of the most important of these laws had already been put in place by way of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which prevented the states from violating the basic civil rights of U.S. citizens, depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or denying to any person within their jurisdictions the equal protection of the laws. That was the 14th Amendment, while the right to vote was guaranteed to all men, that is, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude by the 15th Amendment. Lastly, social reconstruction would be the Herculean effort to pass and enforce laws in addition to establishing institutions designed to create a new South wherein free blacks and whites could live alongside one another in peace. This process began with the passage of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, while the war was still being fought, and then after the war with a host of other initiatives, amongst them the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau and the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875, as well as the Military Reconstruction Acts enforced by the military and passed because, in a sense, the Civil War didn't come to an end in 1865. It was simply fought in a more localized and less grandly violent way on through 1877 for another 12 long, violent, and bloody years. The South had to be divided into 5 zones of military occupation to deal with the problem of terrorist violence because of organizations such as the infamous Ku Klux Klan, as well as other organizations of lesser repute. The Klan was established in 1866 primarily to terrorize and kill not just free blacks, but white Republicans who had come down from the North, no good damn Yankees, to take advantage of opportunities in the South and to help to enforce the new socio-political order. In other words, the Klan was an equal opportunity abuser of both white and black alike, as long as the individuals in question were seeking to advance the New South and undermine the ways of the past, and their actions inspired other groups to take up the knife, gun, and rope and act likewise. I mean, look at this political cartoon here, right? You see this freedman, a free black former slave with his ballot, right? He's trying to vote. You can see it written right here, okay? And he's sort of coming up to the polling place, you know, which looks like it's in like a former military installation, you know. And then here you've got this, you know, the Constitution gives the Negro the right to vote and et cetera. But then you've got all these scary rednecks, you know, Klan members, dudes with their guns, obviously former Confederate military men, you know, sitting on the cannon with the guns in their hands and everything, you know. I mean, clearly not a very, let's say, inviting prospect, you know, a little formidable to sort of go in there and freely cast your right to vote. You know, this it was not a sort of easy process, let's say, or a very inviting prospect to sort of go down and engage in this new democratic process that was supposed to be playing itself out in the South. At any rate, in the state of Mississippi in the year of 1872 alone, over 1,000 persons were murdered by terrorists, mostly the Klan. It was to combat this violence that the federal government was forced to have the army in the South as an occupying force when it would rather have had fighting Indians in the West. Go back 2 images, just rewind the video a little, and you can see that map of the military zones of occupation in the South. And again, this went on for more than a decade, okay, with the army occupying the South, trying to maintain order, trying to control the Klan and other terrorist organizations. And just, there were many people engaging in violence that weren't part of any organization at all. They were just lynching people, killing people, beating people down, stabbing, shooting, and so on and so forth. By 1877, after 12 long years of this, which was 16 years after the Civil War proper had begun, the nation was well and truly weary of dealing with the problem of violent Southerners. And outside of the South, the attitude had become, let them sort out their own problems. It's pretty clear that the rest of the country can't sort them out for them. So an agreement was reached between the Democrats and the Republicans that the military occupation would end, and the South would be pretty much left to its own devices as long as there were no extraordinary abuses of the civil rights of former slaves. I mean, as if lynching, murder, was not an extraordinary abuse of civil rights, right? And so segregation came into play, and the concept of Jim Crow, separate but equal laws enforcing segregation, and the near total oppression of the former slaves. But those are stories for another day, and stories that will intersect in one way or another with the story of Mexican-American history further down the road. Okay, now the second theme that I'd like to explore is that of the corrupted federal government. In the 21st century, we're used to the idea of the president as the leader of the United States. And without even thinking about it, we consider the executive branch to be the most powerful of the 3 branches of the federal government. But that's not how the Founding Fathers intended it to be, and that's not how it was, not really, not until the early 20th century. The Founders had just fought and won a war for independence against a corrupt British government and its king, a king who they saw as tyrannical and overreaching in his power. Most of them were hardly interested in creating an American counterpart, okay? In other words, they did not want the president to be a king. So what they did was construct, in James Madison's words, was a king of limited power. The executive branch would have power, and important powers to be sure, but it would not be able to exercise any of them without the permission of the legislative branch, which was where most of the real power was supposed to be located. Congress was supposed to have most of the real power. Executive power was expanded upon, built upon, by such presidents as Washington, Jefferson, and Jackson. as the 19th century moved forward. And then Abraham Lincoln increased it dramatically to navigate the uncharted waters of the Civil War. By the time Lincoln was assassinated, executive power had doubled, and Congress was none too happy about it, because where one branch's power waxes or grows, the power of the other branches wane to some degree, particularly when you're talking about the balance of power between Congress and the presidency. Okay? When the presidency gets more powerful, Congress relatively tends to get sort of weaker. If Congress gets more powerful, the presidency relatively tends to diminish. After Lincoln's assassination, Congress saw a twofold opportunity present itself. Lincoln had been firmly behind the idea of treating the South with kindness and welcoming them back into the Union as wayward brothers gone astray. No vengeance, no punishment. His vision of Reconstruction was kinder and gentler. And he was backed in this not only by the Union's great war hero, Ulysses S. Grant, who you see here, but, and there's a typo, but by the prestigious Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. But the majority of Northern congressmen felt otherwise. They believed that the South must be punished for having betrayed the Union and having put the nation through 4 years of hell. And their vision of Reconstruction, ultimately to be termed radical Reconstruction, was one in which this dream was carried out to its fullest, with Lincoln dead and his weak Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner, taking his place. They saw their chance to not only push through their version of Reconstruction, but to reduce executive power back to its proper pre-war dimensions, shrinking the presidency and restoring congressional power. And so a struggle began between the two branches of government over just what shape Reconstruction should take. And while it would take over 2 years for the drama to fully play out, and a threatened impeachment of President Andrew Johnson to bring matters to a close, ultimately, after a lot of drama, a lot of soap opera, ultimately Congress won the war of willpower, and Johnson essentially retired as a spent political force for the remainder of his time in office, leaving Congress in the seat of power to run the country, which is what they would do for the most part over the course of the next 30 years, through the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. During those 3 decades, the presidents that came and went ranged from the absolutely miserable Grant to the fairly capable Grover Cleveland to the, we'll never really know, Garfield, who was assassinated very quickly into his presidency. But what they all shared in common is that none of them were a Jefferson, Jackson, or Lincoln. There were no Roosevelts, Wilsons, nor Kennedys in the bunch. And what I mean by this is that these men were not real leaders. They were not possessed of vision. They were not content to be the sort of presidents of lesser power, they were content to be the sort of presidents of lesser power that the Founding Fathers had always intended them to be. In other words, they pretty much let Congress manage the affairs of the country. But if that's the way it was always supposed to be, then what's up with the title of this section of the lecture, The Corrupted Federal Government? Well, here's the thing. The Civil War presented the Union with a challenge unlike anything in its 80-year history up to that point. And that is to say, winning a much, much bigger war than any it had ever fought, and against its own countrymen right there in the heart of its own country. This required mobilizing all of the nation's resources in new and innovative ways, and most importantly, establishing new relationships between the barons of big business and political leaders at the city, state, and federal levels to make sure that whatever needed getting done got done, and fast, like yesterday. If need be, hands were shook, deals were struck, laws were passed, factories were built, new mines were opened up, canals were lengthened, railways were laid, extractive industries were expanded, new lands opened up for agriculture, and all of this was done faster and with greater efficiency than ever before. Not everything worked, but mountains were moved and miracles were achieved in the North's efforts to preserve the Union and win the Civil War. And in the process of all of this, a lot of money changed hands. And a lot of that money was corrupt money, graft, bribes, payoffs, just guys doing business. Nobody really thought anything of it, just business getting done. But still, it never went away. Ask yourself quick, which of our two major political parties do you associate most closely with the power of big business, big corporate business? The Republicans or the Democrats? You know your answer is the Republicans. But did you ever wonder why? Why the Republicans? It all started here. Because at the time of the Civil War, the Republicans were the party of the North, of the Union, whereas most of the Democrats were Southerners. They were with the Confederacy, with the slave power. So it was the Republicans cutting pretty much all of these deals, making these arrangements, getting into bed with big business during these essential relationship building years with the captains of industry. It wasn't the Democrats. Okay? This is a great political cartoon. It says history repeats itself. The robber barons of the Middle Ages and the robber barons of today. So here you've got the big wealthy robber barons and the peasants, the poor people, coming up and coughing up their taxes, right, to be protected and taken care of. And so here you've got the same thing all over again in the late 19th century. The big captains of industry, the railroad barons and the factory owners and so on and so forth, the big businessmen, right, the guys that control the taxes, the monopolies on business and everything, right? And then there's everybody coming up, paying their taxes, all the people, the farmers, the regular folks like you and me, everybody coming up and coughing up their taxes, just trying to survive. Anyway, now, when the war was over and done with, do you think that all these political leaders, congressmen, governors, and whatnot, and all these big business fat cats, do you really think they stopped doing business together the same old way? Of course not. And do you think that once all these members of Congress became even more powerful than ever, after they smacked the presidency back down into the corner, and it was Congress that became like the collective kings of America, do you think they all became really humble and sweet and just good guys? And of course not. It was this period in American history, the 1870s into the 1890s, that Mark Twain referred to as the Gilded Age. Because even though it was shiny and golden, it was just a coating, a gilding, a thin veneer over a cheap, nasty, and dishonest surface. This is the most corrupt political period in American history. And it wasn't just at the federal level, guys. State politics, city politics, small town, at all levels of politics, guys were on the take. Bribes, graft, corruption. It was like the air that everyone breathed. It was 100% natural. It was the way of the world, our world, the American world. The only very marked difference between the average civilized man and the average savage is that the one is gilded and the other is painted, said Twain. Okay? The Gilded Age. You guys think there's a lot of corruption today, right? What's the whole sort of essence of our political culture, recently here in the early 20th century? Just tremendous political corruption, right? It's nothing compared to the Gilded Age, the late 19th century, the late 1800s, guys. Okay, now, anyone who got a job in any government office, any bureaucracy, they got it because of a bribe. They knew someone, because there were no qualifications. There was no meritocracy. Nobody got a job because of merit, because they were skilled, talented, because they had the chops. They got it because they knew somebody. They paid somebody off. They bribed. Some kind of deal was made. Eventually, though, the public started to see this. Just like now, right? People like waking up to this stuff and like, what the hell's going on around here? And so in 1880, James Garfield ran for the presidency with civil service reform as his main platform. And he was assassinated after the election by this cat who was angry over the fact that he believed he'd helped Garfield to get elected and that Garfield had not properly repaid him with the right kind of civil service job after he won the election. After this, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883, which made the system into more of a meritocracy and forced into play a process whereby in order to get a civil service job, one had to pass a strenuous examination to prove competency. No more getting the fat government job by way of payoffs or just by being someone's brother-in-law. Okay, you know, there was a little bit of reform going on here. Things were starting to change, okay? This is clearly a step in the right direction. But you may be wondering, with such a succession of mediocre presidents, how do we get from here to the more dynamic and powerful presidents of the 20th century? Well, hang in there, folks, because Theodore Roosevelt's coming. Teddy and his mighty fists, all right? He's coming. He's on the horizon. Things are going to be changing, all right? Just be patient. Now, the third theme, pardon me, the new immigration. Prior to the Civil War, the country's ethnic population had not been very diverse. The bulk of the white population had been overwhelmingly comprised of people of English, Scottish, German, yeah, Dutch, and Irish stock. Over 95% of the whites in the country were these 5 ethnicities, with a smattering of other ethnicities and nationalities in the mix. You know, there were a few Swedes and Frenchmen, Canadians, whatnot, okay? There were African slaves and free blacks, representing many African ethnic groups, and, of course, Indians of many ethnic identities. The Southwest and California, which had only recently become part of the Union, had a large population of Mexicans, in 21st century parlance, Mexican Americans, as well as a significant number of Asian immigrants from China and Japan, in California, and the Pacific Northwest. On the face of it, this is certainly not a homogeneous population, but compared to what the country would look like by the early 1900s, it was like a big gallon of milk next to a 12-pack of every flavor of Kool-Aid imaginable. Between the 1860s and 1900, the country would be inundated, flooded, overwhelmed by millions of immigrants from Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Russia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Croatia, Serbia, and Slovakia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Greece, and Italy, Korea and the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Canada alone sent us approximately 800,000 of its citizens during these 40 years. Many of them the Quebecois, English and French-speaking Canadians. And of course, immigrants continued to come from the old reliables. Jolly good England, Germany, Ireland, and Mexico. It was a mass exodus of humanity, unparalleled in all of the history of humankind, never before seen and probably never to be seen again. And the motives? Economic opportunity in the form of cheap land and or jobs, the promise of liberty and freedom, not to mention safety from dictatorship and civil wars, Ours had just ended. And even when it was happening, the majority of the country was free from any difficulties associated with it. You could immigrate into the north, get a job, move off into the western part of the country. The Civil War was happening in another part of the country, no problem. This is where the importance of what historians refer to as the push-pull factor can best be seen. In considering any immigration story, there is always some one or more factors pushing the individual or family or group out of their country, and some one or more factors pulling them into the destination country. Consider Mexican immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century, for example. The pressures of the Porfiriato, more on that in a coming lecture, with its tremendous economic hardships, forced Mexicans in the north to cross into the American Southwest in search of a better way to make a living, and later, the violence of the Mexican Revolution combined with this, fear of death plus an inability to earn a living, to send a full 10% of Mexico's population into the U.S. Push and pull. But as more and more different ethnic and racial groups arrived in the United States, it raised larger and more frequent questions about the value of these immigrants. Questions of assimilation, questions of what made America great, and the changes being wrought upon the country by the introduction of so many new cultural contributions, ideas, and ways of doing things. Many wondered if too many new and exotic spices might not spoil the flavor of the great American melting pot. But others argued if we are a nation of immigrants and are so great, then doesn't that mean that our greatness is predicated or based upon immigration? That immigration is the key to our success, our wealth? After all, what is it that made us so wealthy anyway? I don't know exactly at what point in time you will be watching this video lecture. I'm recording it in January of 2017. It may last for a few years or more before I re-record it. But think about the huge debates of 2016 surrounding the election, the battle between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and everything leading up to it, and the great debate over Muslim immigration and bringing in refugees from the Middle East, from Syria, and the question of assimilation, and, the big debate, can these people become real Americans? Can they really be assimilated? What are their, can they really contribute to, to America? Can they become real Americans? Think about all that sort of, in my opinion, nonsense talk. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Okay, in my opinion, editorializing here, but this is an old debate, guys. Right? I'm telling you, this is what people were talking about regarding all these immigrant groups that I just talked about in the early 20th, late 19th century. People were jumping up and down and hollering about the Germans back in the 1720s or 17, yeah, in the 1720s and 1717. Yeah, in the 1720s and 1730s, there's too many Germans coming in. They're going to overrun the country. There's whole areas of Philadelphia that are like, it's like Germany. The street signs, they can't be assimilated. They speak German everywhere. This is a debate that goes all the way back to the foundations of the country. Is there anybody in the United States nowadays that are all worked up over German Americans? No. Anyway, the debate continues. Now, the fourth theme, quattro, industrialization and big business. There have been few legitimate economic geniuses in history. Alexander Hamilton was one of them, and he was the Secretary of the Treasury in the 1790s, at the time of the nation's birth under the Constitution, in a position where his thinking was able to have maximum impact upon the young republic at a time when her economy was in ruins and was like a big blob of clay on a potter's wheel, ready to be shaped into whatever a strong pair of hands could make her into. Happily for the United States, Hamilton's hands were nothing if not strong. Hamilton knew that nothing was more important than creating a crash program for manufacturing, industrialization. And he made a bold prediction, okay, in the early 1790s. I'm paraphrasing here, but this is the essence of it. By 1900, he said, the United States will be the greatest industrial power in the world. Now, this would be like some guy standing at a small town crossroads on the Nebraska prairie with some ragtag baseball team that just won the divisional championship in 1933 and saying that by the year 2000, we're going to be greater than the New York Yankees. Somebody's going to smack him in the head because he's nuts. No way that that is ever going to happen. When Hamilton made this prediction, England, France, and the Netherlands were the great industrial powers of the world, each nation in possession of hundreds of factories and building more weekly, whereas on the other hand, the U.S. had less workshops than you have fingers on two hands, yet he knew he was right because he could see the evidence all around him. Deductive reasoning, Watson, and a century before anyone had heard of Sherlock Holmes. First off, says Hamilton, we have far more land than any of those countries. And in the long run, we can accommodate more and larger factories than they can because we have more space to build factories. Okay? And more land also means more resources. I mean, not necessarily. Just because you got a big country doesn't mean it's full of resources, but we do have them. We have a resource-rich country. They get almost all of the resources for their factories from their colonies. They used to get a lot of them from us. England did, okay, before we won the revolution and became independent. But we'll get ours right here. And that includes energy. Water, we've got enough streams and rivers to power every factory in New England and the rest of the northern states. And later, when we turn to coal as an energy source, now he didn't say this because he didn't know that would happen, okay? But I'm telling you this. Well, we're going to have plenty of that too. So, okay, we have land, check. Resources, check. Energy, check. Now, what about labor? You betcha. Plenty of lower class workers in the country and more immigrants coming in all the time looking for good paying, steady work. No worries there. So, okay, what else do we need? Hey, we need markets. We have a vast and growing population. Love that steady flow of immigration to sell our products to. And many trade partners in other countries. Check. Got that covered. What about capital and a business-friendly climate? Sure thing. This government, where I'm the Secretary of the Treasury, we're going to bend over backward if I have any influence over policy matters to make loans available to forward-thinking entrepreneurs with big ideas who need lines of credit to set up manufacturing facilities to produce this thing and that thing. If they're going to employ people, produce goods, sell, generate revenues, create tax dollars, expand our economy, hallelujah. And Congress is going to pass law after law to make it absolutely clear that the US of A is a place where business is our best friend. We want people in business doing business, especially the business of making, building, manufacturing, yes sirree, Bob. And as all of this snowballs for day, week, month, and year, decade, over the course of the next 100 years, mark my words, we will be the greatest industrial power in the world. And he was 100% right. Everything went just as Hamilton predicted and took a quantum leap forward at the time of the Civil War. Remember, at that point, there was a geometric expansion of business and productivity. I mean, it went off the charts. Let me give you an example to further elaborate on what I was talking about 2 sections back in the lecture. Prior to the war, in the late 1850s, Singer Sewing Machines was one of the biggest companies in the United States, employing just over 100 people. Okay, this is a company, not a store. Think about like your average Target, just a store. How many people work at Target, the closest Target near you? Or Macy's, or Home Depot? 200 people or something? Okay, Singer Sewing Machines, the whole company, employed like just over 100 people, right? But by 1900, Singer employed over 90,000 people in like 40 years. It went from 100 people to 90,000 people. And this is what happened to every large company in the country. And as each company grew, productivity grew with it. Steel production increased from 13,000 tons in 1860 to 111,000 tons by 1900. Petroleum went up from 2,000 barrels in 1859 to 63,000 barrels in 1800. I could cite statistics, throw them at you guys like this for pages and pages, slide after slide, and bore you to death. I don't want to do that. I'm just giving you a taste, okay, to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, okay? We're talking about a massive expansion of industry and big business. Companies and corporations became increasingly skillful at obtaining control over their industries through vertical and or horizontal integration. A vertical integration refers to a process whereby all of the elements that go into the offering of a product are brought under the control of the company, as in this example, the lower left of the meatpacking industry. Horizontal integration, a process wherein, say, an oil company buys up all of the competition or all of the sources of the commodity in question. Either of these practices can lead to the creation of monopolistic power that usually prove to be harmful to the public welfare because there were no competitive checks on ownership to charge fair prices for goods or rates. In the case of railroads, for example, increasingly, companies would band their fortunes together into trusts, wherein they would be managed by a group of trustees as one company in order to eliminate competition and ensure maximum profitability for shareholders. And again, with little or no thought for the welfare of the public interest. The only thing they thought about was profit. Standard Oil controlled 90% of global oil production by 1879. By 1906, two-thirds of the railroads of the country were owned by 7 companies. And these are only 2 examples of the kind of concentration of power that had taken place in the late 19th century throughout the American economy in the manufacturing sector, as well as in the area of public utilities, electricity, natural gas, railroads, etc. Pardon me. A couple of cool political cartoons to give you a sense of Standard Oil's dominance, right? Here you see Standard Oil often portrayed as a big sort of octopus reaching out its tentacles, pipelines, right? But tentacles to grab a hold of banks and shipping lines and smaller oil companies and railways and just everything it needed to sort of, including Washington, D.C., right? You know, to sort of maximize profitability and pull everything sort of into itself to just get bigger and bigger and more powerful. Same thing over here, but in a more sophisticated way in terms of just the artistic representation, grabbing the Capitol, grabbing congressmen, grabbing the White House, grabbing, you know, everything, right? Reaching out across the ocean, grabbing, you know, oil wells, and etc. and so on. You get the idea. Now, the American dream was based on success. So on the one hand, it was hard to argue with a man or a group of men making something of themselves and climbing as high as they could. But many wondered if there was a limit to how high men should climb and how much wealth they should amass if their success was won at the expense of too many of their countrymen who, by contrast, were living lives of want, and often as a direct result of the great wealth possessed by these captains of industry. Or were they robber barons? The first thing sounds pretty positive. The second thing, not so good. Public opinion was deeply divided on this issue, but one thing was for certain. Amongst the lower class, increasingly large numbers of Americans who were feeling the disparity of an unequal distribution of income were becoming more and more convinced as the country moved toward its close or as the century, moved toward its close, that the only way they could receive any sort of justice from the system was if they forced the issue. And the only way to do that was through strength in numbers. And that meant joining a union. So, theme cinco. You didn't know I spoke Spanish, did you? I don't. But anyway. Okay. The American labor movement. Agua. The first real unions were called the working men's parties. They were formed in the late 1820s, early 1830s, and they were equal parts labor unions and political parties, just as the name implies. These organizations were the instruments of workers and called for equality among all classes, fair systems of taxation, and universal public education. But it was not until after the Civil War that the first true union movement emerged with the Knights of Labor in 1869. Strongly critical of capitalism and committed to the notion that a strength in numbers approach through one big union that included both skilled and unskilled workers was the key to success. The Knights allowed in women workers as well as non-whites, although they did unfortunately exclude Chinese workers. They urged their members to use their voting power to back Knights-supported candidates and ballot measures to effect pro-labor political change. But ultimately their image was tainted in the public eye by the labor-involved Haymarket Square riot and bombing of 1886, in which several policemen died. The Knights never recovered, but from the ashes of their organization, a far more effective and powerful union was to emerge, the American Federation of Labor, led by the formidable Samuel Gompers. The AFL, established in 1886, stood for pure and simple unionism. Pure, meaning membership was restricted to workers organized by craft and occupation, and simple, referring to their objectives: better wages, hours, and working conditions. No political involvement, just straightforward collective bargaining with the bosses. By 1900, the AFL had well over 2 million members, but there were more than 15 million workers in the country. So where were the rest of them? This speaks to the limitations of the AFL's vision. No unskilled workers, no women, no non-white workers. And this, in a nutshell, sums up the overall weakness of the American labor movement from the 1820s all the way through to the 1930s. In their inability to truly come together as workers, all workers, united in strength, their weaknesses were easily exploited by the vast power arrayed against them. When women couldn't join, blacks, Mexicans, Chinese, Italians, hell, you fill in the ethnic group blank, couldn't join. Unskilled workers couldn't join. The more unions, and not just the biggest mentioned here, but the dozens of smaller ones as well, created ways to keep workers out, the more they weakened their potential for strength. Why would they do this? Simple racism, sexism, prejudice? No. Although certainly those factors had their part in decision making. The problem was that white men earned a certain amount per hour or day, and non-whites made less, and women made less than that, and blacks made less than Mexicans, and unskilled workers made less than skilled, and so on. And so the logic went, if we allow blanks in, then we're harming our collective bargaining ability, because then we can't bargain for the same wages if they're in with us. And the bosses knew it. They knew how to exploit these weaknesses, drive wedges into these fissures and widen them into cracks, and those into crevices. They knew how to keep all these groups apart. And if any of them got uppity, or there were any real problems, on the side of the bosses, management, and ownership, there were always the police, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, the National Guard, state militias, and even sometimes the U.S. Army if things got really tough. I mean, if there were when strikes got gnarly, the governor of a state could call the president, and the president would send in the army, man, to help break the workers down, you know? And all the workers ever had was themselves. For 100 years, they could only rely on themselves against all of that money and all of that power that was aligned against them. So not until the 1930s, until the New Deal, until the Great Depression, it wasn't until then that the federal government got on the side of the workers. That's when the labor movement really got some strength and made some real forward movement. But we'll get to that later. Now, last but not least, number 6, the pacification of the West. Was it a pacification? Did we make the West more peaceful? Or was it a conquest? Did we kick its ass? It was certainly made much more peaceful, but only by way of conquering an awful lot of Indians who were not thrilled about the situation. But before we get to that, let's consider the question of why go to the West at all? After all, the territory the United States owned east of the Mississippi River was larger than all of Europe combined. I mean, wasn't that enough land? Well, no. And it hadn't been. Not since Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase way back in 1803. Jefferson dreamed of land for 100 generations of yeoman farmers. That was his big line. And besides, there was always a sense that in America there would never be room enough, that every man should have as much room as he wanted or could afford, and so long as there was open space to expand into, well, why not keep moving west? After all, the only thing in the way were the Indians, and they'd already proven to be not much of an obstacle at all. Such was the logic of the early 1800s. But by the end of the Civil War, there was other logic at work as well. A logic that combined with the needs of labor and immigration, industry and big business, and this was the logic of resources. The West was full of them. Land to be farmed, ranched, logged, and mined by the hardworking sons of America and the equally hardworking recently arrived immigrants, and all of the raw materials from those enterprises to be sent back into the factories to provide jobs for the lower class toilers of the big cities of the East. Even as the Civil War was being fought, Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862, allowing for 160 acres of free land to any man who settled down on said land, unclaimed of course, in the Western territories or states for 5 years and improved it, meaning worked it, farmed it, built a place to live on it, made it his in a demonstrable way. It was hoped that this law would attract settlers to the West, and indeed it did. Over 2.5 million farms sprang up within a decade, and so successful was it as an endeavor that the Canadian government copied it shortly thereafter to attract settlers to their more northerly part of the Great Plains. Now, I always like to use this as a kind of example. I know that you guys don't have a clue in the world what an acre is, so to you, what does 160 acres even mean? If you've ever been to Disneyland and California Great Adventure and the parking lot, that whole big piece of real estate, that's about 60 acres. Okay? So 3 times that much land, basically, more or less, roughly, for free. Okay? I mean, pretty awesome deal, right? Now, to transport all the raw materials of the West back east, this required railroads. And once again, even as the Civil War was being fought, the Union was working on railway extensions into the West, but with even more energy after the war was won, and with telegraph lines to accompany them for communication. By 1900, 193,000 miles of railroad track would be laid in the U.S., more than triple that of any other country in the world. And it was the railroad more than anything else that would transform the West and enable the conquest of its Native American inhabitants. Okay? This gives you a sense of the big trunk lines, okay, the main railway lines of the West, okay? Then this gives you a sense of railroad growth between 1870 and 1890, major rail lines by 1870, and then the mail lines added between 1870 and 90. Okay, this gives you a sense nationwide. You can see what's going on, right? binding the East with the West and all points in between. Okay, now the Indians, all of them, from the Apache in the South. Get out of here. Horrible. Sorry. From the Apache in the South, okay, to the Blackfeet in the North, were fiercely resistant to the influx of outsiders into their territories and were such skilled fighters and so knowledgeable the terrain upon which they fought that during the time of the Indian Wars between 1869 and 1889, during which period the last Indians' resistance in the West was snuffed out by the United States military, roughly 5 U.S. soldiers were lost for every 1 Indian fighter that was killed. But inevitably, every essential advantage was on the side of the United States. Manpower, gunpowder, rapid transmission of information by way of the telegraph, the quick deployment of forces and delivery of supplies and reinforcements by way of the railroad, and what's more, the United States military could fight essentially all year round because they had millions of farmers and other productive individuals in distant parts of the country supporting their efforts. The Indians could not afford that sort of nonstop warfare. Time spent fighting was time taken away from hunting, fishing, agriculture, gathering food, and other activities essential to their way of life. So it was only a matter of time. The Indians simply could not win. Even if 5 soldiers were lost for every 1 Indian fighter, there were this many Indian fighters, and there were potentially this many American soldiers. So it was only a matter of time. You can see with this map, pardon me, how slowly but surely the 1850, and then between 50 and 70 and 70 and 90, slowly but surely how more and more Western lands were lost by the Indians, ceded or given by the Indians, lost by way of conquest, really, okay? Given by the Indians over to the United States government, the Indians forced onto reservations. I mean, it was inevitable. There was no way that the Indians could win, okay? And again, by 1889, they were done. The blue pieces of real estate were the reservations that were left to the Indians west of the Mississippi. You can even see a little bit of them east of the Mississippi here, but this is essentially focusing on, the territories and the real estate west of the Mississippi River and what happened to those Indians in that part of the country. Okay. With the inevitability of time passing, the Indians lost one tribe at a time. And I can recommend no better book that chronicles this than D. Brown's essential Bury My Heart a Wounded Knee, which is really unsurpassed in all the time since it was written as a straightforward narrative of the Indian Wars of the late 19th century. Even though it's been almost a half century, I don't think there's a better book that covers the Indian Wars of that period, just as a general narrative history. As each people was defeated, they were forced onto reservations, and often their children were taken from them and placed in Indian schools to hasten the process of assimilation and Americanization. These schools and reservations were little more than factories where, rather than using assembly lines to manufacture goods, disassembly lines of education and indoctrination were used to grind down and destroy culture and identity, certainly with the best of intentions. But those intentions provide little comfort with 2020 hindsight, nor do they provide much comfort to those being subjected to them at the time. So, the South being remade into something new, ultimately in an image conjured by its longtime oppressors. The corrupted federal government flexing its muscles towards the 20th century. The new immigration altering the racial and ethnic landscape of the Republic. The dramatic growth of industry and big business dramatically altering the economic landscape of the Republic. The growth of labor and the challenge of the lower class as they asked for their piece of the pie of American prosperity. And the expansion into and conquest of the West. A brief summing up of some of the more essential themes of late 19th century. to contrast against a slightly more in-depth look at late 19th century Mexican history coming up in the next 2 video lectures. Thanks for being here, guys. I will see you next time. You can read over this thing here about the destruction of the buffalo alongside this kind of awe-inspiring, a very famous photograph of this mountain of buffalo skulls. Pretty astonishing. Anyway, see you soon.